They said the dog was unstable. They said the incident was an accident. And they said the man who warned them was just another problem that needed to disappear quietly. Years later, a retired SEAL walked back into a frozen K-9 facility with nothing left to lose. The dog they had locked away did not bark, did not panic. He stood up straight, locked his eyes on one name, and remembered something everyone else tried to forget. Because some truths do not fade with time. Some memories do not belong to men alone, and sometimes God leaves a witness behind, not to attack, but to wait. This is not just a story about a soldier and a dog. It is about what happens when faith outlasts silence and the truth finally answers the call. Winter sat heavily over Marquette, Michigan. The lake frozen into a dull sheet of steel beneath a pale sky, the wind off Lake Superior cutting clean and sharp through the quiet streets. The military K-9 facility on the outskirts of town stood silent against the cold concrete walls dusted with snow, built to endure seasons like this without acknowledgement. Graham Ellis Northwood drove through the outer gate without ceremony. At 39, he had mastered the art of arriving unnoticed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his frame still carrying the disciplined strength of years spent under physical demands most people never experienced. His hair was cut short, dark blonde fading toward gray at the temples, and a thin scar traced the edge of his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a life he no longer spoke about. His face was calm to the point of unreadable, the expression of a man who had learned that reacting too quickly often made things worse. Graham dressed plainly, a navy field jacket worn soft with age, a gray thermal shirt beneath it, dark cargo pants, and scuffed tactical boots that had seen more miles than he could count. Nothing about him suggested rank, unit, or former distinction, and that was intentional. The guard at the gate, young and eager, checked Graham's identification twice before waving him through. Recognition hovered, but never landed. Graham returned a polite nod and continued on, already fading from memory. Being forgettable had become a survival skill after the Navy. He parked near the administrative building and sat for a moment with the engine off. The silence pressed in, broken only by the wind and the distant clang of something metal shifting in the cold. Graham rested his hands on the steering wheel, steady, controlled. He hadn't planned to come back to a place like this. After leaving the teams, he had kept his distance, taking work that required isolation and minimal explanation. Security consulting, equipment inspection, short-term contracts that ended cleanly. But some names refused to stay buried. Breyer. The message had arrived 3 days earlier, brief and unadorned, from someone Graham trusted to speak plainly. Breyer listed as non-reassignable. Behavioral flag. Review pending. No explanation, no reassurance, just enough to pull Graham back across state lines and into a world he'd sworn off. Breyer was a German shepherd, 7 years old now, bred and trained for military service. He was larger than average, dark sable in color, with amber eyes that missed nothing. His ears carried faint scars, old injuries healed but never erased. As a younger dog, Breyer had been intense, difficult for inexperienced handlers. With Graham, he had settled into something precise and deliberate. Breyer didn't bark unless necessary. He didn't waste energy. He watched, waited, and acted with quiet certainty. Graham had trusted him with his life more times than he could count. Graham stepped out of the truck, the cold biting immediately through his jacket. The air smelled of pine, concrete, and the sterile undertone of a working facility. As he walked toward the entrance, his boots crunched softly against the thin layer of snow. Every step felt heavier than it should have, not from the distance, but from the weight of what he might find inside. The lobby was warm, lit by humming fluorescent lights that cast a flat glow over beige walls and polished concrete floors. Notices and schedules were pinned neatly to bulletin boards. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her late 30s, medium height, dark hair pulled into a low bun, her posture relaxed but attentive. This was Hannah Price, the senior veterinary officer. Years working between military structure and animal behavior had shaped her into someone observant and measured. A difficult deployment early in her career, one marked by preventable loss, had made her careful with conclusions and slow to dismiss irregularities. She looked up as Graham approached, her eyes sharp without being unkind. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone professional even. "I'm here about a K9 review," Graham said. His voice was low, steady. "German Shepherd. Name's Breyer." Something subtle shifted in her expression. Hannah glanced at her monitor, fingers moving quickly. "Your name?" "Graham Northwood." She paused, eyes lifting to study him more carefully now. "You're listed as former handler." "I am." A brief silence followed, filled with distant barking echoing faintly from deeper in the facility. Hannah stood. "You'll need to wait," she said, already moving toward a secured door behind the desk. Graham remained where he was, hands at his sides, gaze unfocused. The building felt familiar in the way all military spaces did, structured and indifferent. Somewhere beyond the administrative wing, behind reinforced doors and controlled corridors, Breyer was being held. Graham understood what non-reassignable meant. It didn't always mean immediate destruction, but it meant isolation, containment, and the quiet erasure of a working life that had once mattered. When Hannah returned, she gestured for Graham to follow. They walked down a long corridor toward the kennel wing. "He's under restricted status," she said as they moved. "Not cleared for interaction." "I understand," Graham replied. He meant that literally. They stopped at a heavy steel door marked with warning signage. Hannah entered a code, hesitated, then met his eyes. "He's been assessed as reactive," she said. Not indiscriminately, but enough that a recommendation was made. "Reactive to what?" Graham asked. She shook her head slightly. "That's still under review." The corridor beyond the steel door was narrower and quieter than the rest of the facility, the kind of hallway designed to discourage lingering. The lights here were dimmer, spaced farther apart, casting long shadows along the concrete floor. Graham Ellis Northwood walked beside Hannah Price without speaking, his pace steady, his gaze forward. The further they went, the more the familiar sounds of the kennel wing fell away. The barking, the movement, the life. What replaced it was something heavier. Contained, controlled, intentional. "This section isn't part of the regular reassignment program," Hannah said after a moment. Her voice echoed softly, restrained by the walls. "Dogs placed here are under behavioral observation only, no volunteer interaction. No adoption visits." Graham nodded once. He had expected that. Places like this existed in every system, military or civilian. Rooms where difficult things were placed so they could be dealt with later, or not at all. They passed 2 kennels on the left, both empty, their metal doors closed and tagged. At the end of the corridor, slightly set apart from the others, was the last enclosure. Thicker bars, reinforced hinges, a small red placard clipped to the side, worn from being handled too often. Hannah slowed as they approached. "That's him," she said quietly. Breyer stood at the far end of the kennel, his body angled toward the back wall, his head lowered but not resting. He was larger than Graham remembered, or perhaps memory had softened him over time. His dark sable coat had dulled slightly with age, the black along his spine threaded now with gray. Old scars were visible beneath the fur, where it lay thinner along his shoulders and neck, marks left by years of service that had never quite faded. His ears were upright but tilted back just enough to signal alertness without aggression. His eyes, amber and sharp, tracked the movement outside the kennel without blinking. He did not bark. He did not growl. He did not pace. Instead, Breyer stood perfectly still, weight balanced evenly across all 4 paws, muscles taut beneath his coat. It was the posture of a working dog in standby mode, neither relaxed nor panicked. Waiting. Graham stopped a few feet back, hands loose at his sides. He felt something tighten in his chest, not surprise, but recognition. This was not the posture of an animal spiraling out of control. This was restraint. "How long has he been like this?" Graham asked. Hannah folded her arms loosely, studying Briar with the practiced eye of someone trained to notice what others missed. "Since he was transferred here," she said, "he reacts to certain stimuli, not randomly, not constantly, but enough that the assessment team flagged him as unstable." Graham shifted his weight slightly. "Unstable how?" She hesitated, then exhaled. He lunged once, not at a handler, at a man walking past the enclosure. No contact, no follow-through, but it was enough to raise concerns. Graham watched Briar closely. The dog's eyes flicked briefly toward Hannah's voice, then returned to Graham, settling there with unnerving focus. There was no confusion in them, no frenzy, just awareness. "He hasn't tried again?" Graham asked. "No," Hannah admitted. "Not since. That's part of what doesn't sit right with me." She stepped closer to the kennel, stopping just outside Briar's reach. "Most dogs flagged for aggression escalate," she continued. "Pacing, vocalization, repeated attempts to breach. Briar hasn't done any of that. He eats when fed, sleeps lightly, responds to basic commands through the barrier. He's contained." Graham's jaw tightened. "Contained doesn't mean broken." "No," Hannah said, "it doesn't." Another figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, approaching with measured steps. He was a man in his early 50s, tall but slightly stooped, with thinning hair and a neatly trimmed mustache gone gray. His uniform was worn but meticulously maintained, and his movements carried the easy authority of someone who had spent decades inside the same system. This was Robert Calloway, the facility's operations supervisor, a former handler himself before an injury had ended his field career. Years earlier, a training accident had cost him the full use of his left shoulder, and the resulting frustration had made him rigid about rules, if only because rules were what kept things from slipping beyond control. "I figured you'd make it back here," Calloway said, stopping beside Hannah. His eyes flicked to Graham, then to Briar. "Word travels fast." "Not fast enough," Graham replied evenly. Calloway studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Briar's file is complicated." "That's one way to put it," Hannah said. Calloway cleared his throat. "He's listed as non-reassignable pending further review. We don't take that designation lightly." Graham didn't look away from Briar. "Then why does it feel rushed?" Calloway stiffened slightly. "Because you're personally involved." "Because I know what uncontrolled looks like," Graham said. "And this isn't it." Briar shifted his stance then, just slightly, adjusting his weight forward. His ears angled more sharply, and a low sound vibrated in his chest. Not a growl, but something close enough to register as a warning. Graham didn't move. "Easy," Hannah said quietly, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. Briar's gaze never left Graham, but the sound faded. He remained where he was. Calloway frowned. "That reaction is exactly why he's here." "That reaction is controlled," Hannah countered. "He didn't advance. He didn't bare teeth. He responded to presence, not provocation." Calloway sighed. "You're asking me to ignore a risk." "I'm asking you to recognize a pattern," Hannah said. Graham finally stepped closer to the kennel, stopping just outside the marked boundary on the floor. He did not speak Briar's name. He didn't need to. The dog's entire body shifted, not forward, not back, but into alignment. The posture Graham remembered from countless missions. Ready, focused, waiting for a cue that never came. "How old is he now?" Calloway asked. 7, Graham answered. "Old for the work he was trained for," Calloway said. "Not old enough to be this locked in." Graham glanced at him. He was trained to hold position under stress. Calloway looked away. Hannah knelt slowly near the kennel, her movements deliberate. "What bothers me," she said, "is that his file describes him as unpredictable. But everything I see suggests the opposite. He's predictable, selective. He's not reacting to noise or proximity or confinement. He's reacting to something specific." "And until we know what that is," Calloway said, "he stays here." Graham straightened. "For how long?" Calloway didn't answer immediately. "Until the review board reconvenes." "When is that?" "Not scheduled yet." The silence that followed was thick. Breyer lowered his head slightly, but his eyes remained locked on Graham. The intensity of it was unsettling, not because it felt dangerous, but because it felt deliberate. "He's waiting," Hannah said softly. "Waiting for what?" Calloway asked. Hannah didn't respond right away. She rose to her feet and brushed imaginary dust from her knees. "That's what I intend to find out." Graham took a step back, understanding the unspoken limit of the moment. He had seen Breyer. That alone mattered more than anything else right now. "I want to be notified before any final decision is made," he said. Calloway hesitated, then nodded. "You'll be informed." Morning settled slowly over the facility, the kind of gray dawn that arrived without color or promise. The kennel wing was already awake. Footsteps echoed down concrete corridors, metal doors slid open and closed, and the controlled rhythm of routine filled the air. Graham Ellis Northwood stood near the observation area outside the isolation corridor, hands in the pockets of his jacket, posture relaxed but alert. He had been there for nearly 20 minutes without speaking, watching the subtle movements of the place, listening to the cadence of voices, letting the space reveal itself the way operational environments always did if you gave them time. Hannah Price joined him, carrying a tablet tucked against her side. She looked tired, though she hid it well. Her dark hair was pulled back more tightly than the day before, and faint shadows sat beneath her eyes. She had spent the night reviewing files, cross-referencing behavioral notes, watching archived footage. It wasn't obsession that drove her, but a professional discomfort she'd learned not to ignore. Years ago, during a deployment where a working dog had been written off too quickly, Hannah had watched the animal deteriorate under the weight of misinterpretation. The memory had stayed with her, shaping how she approached every assessment since. "I cleared a short observation window," she said quietly. "No interaction, just presence." "That's enough," Graham replied. They moved together toward the isolation corridor. Two handlers stood near the entrance, both men in their late 20s or early 30s, lean and efficient, the kind of professionals who moved with quiet confidence. One of them, Jason Miller, was tall and narrow-shouldered, his sandy hair cropped close to regulation. He had the guarded look of someone new enough to still believe the system worked exactly as designed. The other, Thomas Reed, was broader, darker-haired, with a permanent crease between his brows. He'd lost a dog during a training accident years earlier, and the experience had left him cautious to the point of severity. "That's him," Miller said under his breath as Graham approached. "Northwood." Reed studied Graham openly. "Didn't think he'd show." Graham ignored the comment, his focus already shifting down the corridor. The steel door opened and the air changed, quieter, heavier. Breyer was visible immediately, standing near the center of his enclosure now, rather than the back wall. He hadn't been lying down. He hadn't been pacing. He had simply repositioned himself, as if aware of something before it happened. Hannah stopped just short of the boundary line painted on the floor. "Remember," she said, "no commands." Graham nodded. He took 2 more steps forward, stopping well within Breyer's field of vision, but outside the kennel. He stood there, hands relaxed, shoulders squared, breathing slow. For a moment, nothing happened. Breyer watched him with the same unwavering intensity as before, ears angled, muscles held in perfect tension. Then Graham spoke. "Northwood?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't project. He simply said his own name, clearly, the way he had in briefings and radio checks, the way it had sounded in places where noise meant danger. The effect was immediate. Breyer's body shifted as if a switch had been thrown. He straightened, head lifting, spine aligning, hind legs tucking beneath him in one fluid motion. He moved forward exactly 3 steps and stopped, sitting squarely, chest out, gaze locked. The transformation was precise, unmistakable. This was not agitation. This was recognition. Miller inhaled sharply. "That's textbook," he murmured. Reed's expression changed, skepticism giving way to something more complicated. "That's handler response," he said, "not stress behavior." Hannah's fingers tightened around the edge of her tablet. She had expected a reaction, but not this. Not this clean. Breyer wasn't reacting to a tone or a command. He was reacting to identity. Graham didn't move. He didn't look away. He let the moment settle, let the room absorb it. Around them, other staff had slowed, drawn by instinct rather than instruction. A woman in her early 40s with cropped black hair and sharp features paused near the far wall. This was Laura Kim, a behavioral analyst brought in periodically for complex cases. She had built her career challenging assumptions, her skepticism born from watching too many decisions made for convenience rather than accuracy. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Breyer hold position. "That's not a dog losing control," Laura said quietly. "That's a dog locking in." Graham took a single step back. Breyer didn't break posture. He didn't advance. He didn't vocalize. He waited. "Why wasn't this in the report?" Laura asked. Hannah didn't answer immediately. "Because no one called his name," she said finally. Robert Calloway appeared in the corridor, his presence announced by the subtle shift that always followed authority. He took in the scene quickly, his gaze moving from Graham to Breyer, then to the small gathering that had formed. "What's going on?" he asked. "Observation," Hannah replied. "Authorized." Calloway studied Breyer's posture, his expression tightening. That dog was flagged for instability. Laura stepped forward. "And yet he's responding with perfect discipline to a single variable." Calloway's jaw worked. Variables don't change outcomes. "History does," Graham said calmly. Calloway looked at him then, really looked at him, and something old flickered there. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "You warned us," Calloway said slowly. Graham didn't deny it. About the training rotation, the timing, the equipment overlap. Miller glanced between them. "He's talking about the winter exercise 2 years back," he said. "The one they restructured after." Reed's face darkened. "That wasn't supposed to be a problem." "It was," Graham replied, "and it was ignored." Breyer shifted only when Graham spoke again, not breaking posture, just adjusting, as if recalibrating. The room was silent now, every eye on the dog that had just reminded them of something inconvenient. Laura exhaled. "This changes the context," she said. "If the dog can distinguish identity with this level of precision, then the behavior profile needs revision." Calloway said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Graham turned slightly, preparing to leave. He had seen what he needed to see. Breyer had answered without being asked. As Graham stepped away, Breyer finally relaxed, easing back into a standing position, though his eyes followed Graham until the steel door closed. The administrative wing felt sealed off from the rest of the facility, its quiet not born from peace, but from distance. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent, as Hannah Price sat alone at her desk. She wore a simple olive sweater, her dark hair pulled back, posture straight despite the late hour. Hannah was known among the staff as precise and restrained, someone who trusted evidence more than consensus. Years earlier, a rushed decision during a deployment had cost a working dog its career, and the memory had made her careful with conclusions that arrived too neatly. Breyer's digital file filled her screen. Service dates, handler assignments, behavioral notes. On the surface, it was orderly. Too orderly. Hannah scrolled slowly, paying attention not to what was written, but to how often it had been revised. Timestamps clustered too closely. Language repeated across different assessments without variation. She opened the incident report tied to the training explosion that had ended Graham Ellis Northwood's active career. The conclusion was blunt and final. Equipment malfunction, no prior indicators, no contributing factors. Hannah switched to archived training footage. The video was grainy, fixed angle, never meant for careful review. She replayed the minutes leading up to the blast. Breyer appeared at the edge of the frame, body tightening, head turning sharply away from the training site. Seconds later, the explosion tore through the scene. Hannah paused the footage and rewound it again. Breyer's reaction came before the detonation, not after. There was no mention of that moment in the report. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. Silence like this did not happen by accident. A knock came at the door. Graham stepped inside without waiting to be invited. He still wore his jacket, his expression controlled, eyes steady. He looked like a man who had already made peace with disappointment, but refused to accept dishonesty. "You're still digging," he said. "I am," Hannah replied, "and I don't like what I'm finding." He took the chair across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "Neither did I." Hannah turned the screen so he could see. "The detonation wasn't supposed to be live," she said. "Correct?" "Correct," Graham replied. It was listed as inert. "And Breyer reacted before it happened?" "Yes," Graham said. "He pulled back, wouldn't settle. I reported it." Hannah's jaw tightened. "That report isn't here." Graham's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I was told it was stress, handler interpretation." "And shortly after, you were reassigned." "Removed," Graham said, quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it pressing in. Outside the office, a cart rolled past, the sound faint and distant. Another knock broke the quiet. Laura Kim stepped in, carrying a slim folder. She was in her 40s, sharp-featured, with cropped black hair and a reputation for challenging official conclusions. Her manner was direct, shaped by years of pushing back against decisions made for convenience. "I reviewed the footage Hannah flagged," Laura said. "The dog shows anticipatory behavior, not panic, not aggression." Graham nodded. He knew something was wrong. Laura glanced at him. "And you said so." "Yes?" "And no one listened." Hannah closed the file on her screen. "What bothers me most isn't the explosion," she said. "It's what followed. No secondary evaluation, no follow-up on the dog. Just a conclusion and silence." Laura's expression hardened. Silence protects systems, not truth. They moved together toward the window overlooking the isolation wing. Breyer's enclosure was visible in the distance, dim and isolated. Breyer lay down inside, head raised, body angled toward the corridor. "He reacted before the blast," Hannah said quietly. "And he's reacting now, not randomly. With purpose." Graham watched the kennel. "They ignored him once," he said. "They're doing it again." Laura nodded slowly. "Not this time." The evaluation room sat at the far end of the facility, a converted training bay stripped down to essentials. Concrete walls, reinforced observation glass, a clean floor marked with faint scuffs from years of controlled drills. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold metal. Graham Ellis Northwood stood near the center line, hands loose at his sides, posture calm. He had slept little. Not from nerves, but from the steady vigilance that had returned to him the moment Breyer's file was reopened. This room felt familiar in the way places of judgment always did. Hannah Price moved with quiet efficiency along the perimeter, tablet in hand. Her expression was composed, professional, her dark hair pulled back, her movements precise. She had framed the test narrowly, deliberately. Presence, proximity, observation, no provocation, no tricks. If Breyer was unstable, the instability would surface without being summoned. If he was not, the room would have to accept that too. Robert Calloway watched from behind the glass with a small group of staff. His stance was rigid, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back. He had agreed to the test reluctantly, pressured by the inconsistencies Hannah and Laura Kim had documented. His loyalty lay with procedure, not outcomes, and he carried himself like a man determined not to be embarrassed by either. Laura Kim stood beside him, arms folded, eyes intent. She said nothing, but her presence altered the room. She had a way of making people aware that their decisions would not vanish into paperwork unnoticed. Breyer was led in by Thomas Reed, the handler with the furrowed brow and cautious movements. Reed kept the leash short but relaxed, his body angled slightly away to give the dog space. Breyer entered without resistance, head level, ears alert, amber eyes scanning the room. His coat was brushed clean, the dark sable fur catching the overhead light. At 7 years old, he moved with measured confidence, not the reckless energy of youth, but not the stiffness of decline either. He took in the environment, cataloged it, then settled his attention on Graham. "Release," Hannah said quietly. Reed unclipped the leash and stepped back. Breyer did not move. He remained standing where he was, weight evenly distributed, tail still. Graham did not speak. He didn't need to. The room was silent enough to hear breathing. The first phase was simple exposure. 2 handlers crossed the room at a measured pace. Jason Miller moved first, tall and lean, posture neutral. Breyer's eyes tracked him briefly, then returned to center. No tension, no sound. A second handler followed from a different angle. Again, Breyer remained steady. Hannah noted the responses, her pen moving smoothly. A civilian staff member entered next, a woman in her early 40s named Evelyn Porter, average height, practical build, with a habit of moving quickly to compensate for a limp earned years earlier during a transport accident. She passed within a few feet of Breyer. He acknowledged her presence with a brief glance and nothing more. "This is not a reactive animal," Laura said softly behind the glass. Calloway did not respond. Minutes passed. The room held its breath. Breyer shifted once, adjusting his stance, then settled again. Graham stood exactly where he was, eyes forward, expression unreadable. The bond between them was visible not in movement, but in restraint. The door at the far end opened. Adrian Lockwood entered without ceremony. He was in his late 40s, tall, lean, his uniform immaculate. His hair was graying at the temples, cut close, his face composed into an expression of practiced authority. Lockwood had built his career on efficiency and decisiveness, rising quickly through ranks that rewarded compliance and results. Those who worked under him described him as distant, exacting, intolerant of hesitation. He had overseen the training cycle tied to the explosion years earlier, a fact recorded cleanly in the files. The moment Lockwood crossed the threshold, Breyer's body changed. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. Breyer stiffened, muscles drawing tight beneath his coat. His ears pinned slightly back, and a low sound rumbled in his chest, not loud, not uncontrolled, but unmistakably a warning. His eyes locked onto Lockwood with intense focus. Several people behind the glass inhaled sharply. "Hold," Hannah said calmly, her voice steady. Breyer did not advance. He did not break position. The low sound continued, controlled, deliberate. Lockwood stopped mid-step. His expression flickered, just briefly, before settling back into composure. "Is this necessary?" he asked. Graham turned his head slightly, not looking at Lockwood, but addressing the room. "Heel?" The command was quiet, firm, spoken once. Briar responded instantly. He sat, posture perfect, shoulders squared, eyes never leaving Lockwood. The growl ceased, but the tension remained coiled, visible in every line of his body. The room was utterly silent. "That's compliance," Laura said behind the glass. "Absolute compliance under stress." Calloway's jaw tightened. "Or suppression." "Suppression breaks," Hannah replied. "This didn't." Lockwood cleared his throat. "This proves nothing. Animals respond to unfamiliar authority all the time." "Then why didn't he respond to anyone else?" Laura asked. Lockwood said nothing. Hannah stepped closer to Graham. "Maintain position," she said. Graham remained still. Lockwood took a cautious step forward. Briar's body tensed further, a deep vibration building again in his chest, restrained but unmistakable. "Sit," Graham said. Briar sat, perfectly, obedience overriding instinct without erasing it. "That's enough," Hannah said. "End test." The tension in the room released slowly, like air from a sealed chamber. Reed moved forward and clipped the leash back on, his hand steady despite the tightness in his jaw. Briar allowed it without resistance, eyes still tracking Lockwood until the man stepped back out of the room. Behind the glass, no one spoke. Calloway finally turned away. "We'll need to review this," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You will," Laura replied, "and so will others." Graham knelt beside Briar as Reed led him out, resting a hand briefly against the dog's shoulder. Briar leaned into the contact for half a second, then straightened, the moment passing as quickly as it came. Some reactions were instinct, others were memory. The facility did not sleep after the test. It slowed, settled into a quieter rhythm, but the tension lingered in the walls and corridors like static after a storm. Hannah Price returned to the behavioral lab with a purpose that had nothing to do with routine. She removed her jacket, rolled up the sleeves of her sweater, and set her tablet aside. This was not an evaluation meant to satisfy a form. This was a question that refused to stay unanswered. Hannah was not a woman given to dramatics. She was of average height, lean, with movements that suggested long practice in staying out of the way of both animals and authority. Her calm demeanor had been shaped by early mistakes and later resolve. Years ago, she had watched a working dog deteriorate after being misclassified, the animal's decline blamed on temperament rather than misinterpretation. The memory had hardened her standards. Tonight, it sharpened her focus. She pulled up Briar's longitudinal data, not the summaries, but the raw inputs. Heart rate variability during drills, response latency to commands, recovery time after stress exposure. The metrics formed a pattern that did not align with the word unstable. They aligned with control, with restraint exercised under pressure. Graham Ellis Northwood sat across the room, leaning back against the counter, arms crossed loosely. He had not been asked to stay, but he had not been told to leave either. He watched Hannah work without interruption, the way he had once watched teammates clear rooms. Attentive, ready. He had seen enough systems misread signals to know that silence here could matter. "He didn't escalate," Hannah said finally, eyes still on the screen. "Not once." Graham nodded. "He never did." She glanced at him. "You're certain?" "Yes," Graham replied. "Briar doesn't improvise under stress. He waits." Hannah brought up a second set of footage, this time from a different angle. It showed Briar during a night training cycle, months before the explosion. The dog moved with purpose, scanning, pausing, recalibrating. Then a familiar tension appeared. The same stiffening, the same controlled readiness. "There," Hannah said, tapping the screen. "That posture again. Same markers." That was the night I filed my first written concern, Graham said. They told me to stop anthropomorphizing. Hannah's mouth tightened. Recognizing learned behavior isn't anthropomorphism. She pulled in Laura Kim, who arrived a few minutes later with a notebook tucked under her arm. Laura moved quickly, efficiently, her sharp eyes taking in the data without preamble. She was dressed simply, dark slacks, a gray shirt, her cropped hair already starting to gray at the temples. Laura's skepticism was not performative. It was earned, forged in years of watching nuance erased by convenience. "Show me the sequence," Laura said. Hannah did. They watched in silence, the room lit by the glow of the screen. Laura leaned closer, studying frame-by-frame transitions. "This isn't fear memory," she said. "This is associative recall." Graham straightened slightly. "Meaning?" "Meaning he's not reacting to the environment," Laura said. "He's reacting to a specific constellation of cues tied to a past event." Hannah nodded. "A memory?" Laura glanced toward the window overlooking the isolation wing. "Animals don't remember like we do," she said. "They don't narrate, they store." "Triggers," Graham said. "Patterns," Laura corrected. "The dog is holding on to a pattern that never resolved." The door opened quietly, and Robert Calloway stepped in, his expression guarded. He looked older than he had during the test, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture slightly less rigid. He had spent his life inside the structure of command, and tonight that structure was pressing back. "You're building a case," he said. Hannah met his gaze. "We're understanding a failure." Calloway exhaled. "Be careful how you phrase that." Laura closed her notebook. "If the conclusion was wrong, phrasing won't change that." Calloway's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "What are you saying exactly?" Hannah turned the screen so he could see the metrics. "Breyer is not unstable. He's not unpredictable. He's exhibiting selective response tied to an unresolved training incident." "And that means?" Calloway asked. "That the official conclusion is incomplete," Laura said. "Possibly incorrect." Calloway ran a hand over his face. "You're suggesting the dog is remembering something we didn't." "I'm suggesting the dog recognized danger before it manifested," Hannah said, "and that recognition was dismissed." Calloway's gaze flicked to Graham. "And you believe that, too?" "I know it," Graham replied evenly. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Calloway turned toward the window, looking out at the dimly lit isolation wing. Breyer was visible only as a shadow moving within the enclosure. His presence felt more than seen. "What does the dog do when there's nothing to respond to?" Calloway asked. "He waits," Hannah said. "That's the point." As if summoned by the conversation, Breyer shifted inside the kennel. He rose, paced once, then stopped, head angled toward the corridor. There was no agitation in his movement. It was watchfulness, purpose. Hannah stood and walked closer to the glass, her voice soft. "He's not trapped in the moment," she said. "He's holding on to it." Graham stepped beside her. "He was trained to identify risk before impact," he said. "To hold position until someone acted." "And no one did," Laura said. "That's what he remembers," Hannah replied. A junior technician named Mark Ellison passed by the doorway, slowing when he sensed the tension inside. Mark was young, barely 30, with a thin build and an earnest expression. He had joined the facility recently, drawn by a desire to work with animals rather than systems. He paused, uncertain, then continued on, the unspoken weight of the room pressing behind him. Calloway turned back. "If this gets out of the building," he said, "it won't stay contained." "It shouldn't," Laura replied. Hannah closed the file, her movements decisive. "We don't need to speculate beyond the evidence," she said. "The evidence says the dog is responding with intent. That intent is tied to an event that was never fully examined." "And if the board asks," Calloway said. "Then we present what we have," Hannah replied, "and we let them draw their conclusions." Graham looked at Briar through the glass. The dog met his gaze briefly, then returned to watching the corridor, posture steady. "He's been waiting a long time," Graham said. Hannah nodded. "So has the truth." The request for independent review did not move loudly. It moved the way serious things often did inside institutions that preferred order to disruption, through formal channels, stamped, logged, and passed from one office to the next without announcement. Hannah Price watched the confirmation email arrive and disappear into the archive, her face composed, her hands steady. She did not celebrate. She knew better than to confuse process with outcome. Hannah had learned early in her career that truth moved at a measured pace, slowed by caution and protected by distance. Still, movement mattered. For the first time since the explosion, the record was no longer sealed by certainty. Robert Calloway convened a brief meeting in the small conference room adjoining the administrative wing. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Calloway stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, eyes tired. He looked less like a gatekeeper now, and more like a man forced to reckon with the weight of a system he had served too long to pretend was flawless. "The file is out of our hands," he said. "An external team will handle interviews and data validation." No one argued. Laura Kim sat with her arms folded, her expression sharp but restrained. She had seen this stage before. It was where truth began to press outward, resisted by habit rather than malice. Graham Ellis Northwood listened without comment. He stood near the wall, posture relaxed, gaze distant. He had learned not to confuse institutional movement with personal closure. The Navy had given him purpose once. It had also taken it away without explanation. This review would not restore years lost or decisions made in quiet rooms. But it would do something else. It would name what had been left unnamed. The interviews began that afternoon. A pair of investigators arrived from outside the region, both civilians with prior military oversight experience. The first was Daniel Reeves, tall and spare, with close-cropped hair and a habit of listening without interruption. The second was Margaret Hale, shorter, silver-haired, her presence calm and exacting. She spoke softly, asked precise questions, and never filled silence with reassurance. Their demeanor made it clear they were not there to protect reputations. They spoke to Hannah first. She answered carefully, providing timelines, data sets, and observations without embellishment. She described Briar's behavior as she had witnessed it, the controlled responses, the selective tension, the anticipatory posture that had been erased by summary language. Margaret Hale took notes in a narrow script, nodding only when clarity replaced assumption. Graham was interviewed next. He sat across from them in a plain room, hands resting on the table, eyes steady. He described the training cycle, the adjustments made under pressure, the concerns he had raised. He spoke without anger, without accusation. He had learned that truth carried more weight when it did not shout. "You understood the risks," Daniel Reeves said. "Yes," Graham replied, "and I understood the cost of ignoring them." "Why didn't you push harder?" Margaret asked. Graham considered the question. "Because I was told the system would handle it," he said. "I believed that once." The investigators moved on to others. Jason Miller spoke cautiously, torn between loyalty and memory. Thomas Reed was more direct, his voice tight as he recalled leash tension, a dog trying to reposition, a warning that hadn't made sense until it was too late. Laura Kim provided her analysis, emphasizing pattern recognition over isolated behavior. Each account added weight, not through drama, but through alignment. Adrian Lockwood was interviewed last. He arrived in a tailored uniform, posture immaculate, expression controlled. He answered questions cleanly, efficiently, acknowledging oversight without admitting fault. He referenced protocols, timelines, authorization thresholds. Margaret Hale listened, penned still. Daniel Reeves asked him to clarify a discrepancy between two versions of the report. Lockwood paused just long enough for the room to notice. The review did not end that day. It did not conclude the next. But it changed the air inside the facility. Conversations softened, postures shifted. Staff moved with a quiet awareness that something had crossed a threshold. News traveled quickly to people who had known Graham before his removal. Miles Kearney was the first to show up. He arrived without notice, leaning against the doorframe of the observation room with a crooked smile and the easy confidence of someone who had spent years in uncomfortable places. Miles was broad, compact, his dark hair threaded with gray, his manner blunt. A roadside explosion years earlier had left him with a slight limp and an aversion to polished narratives. "Heard the old story's getting a second look," Miles said. Graham met his gaze. "It is." Miles nodded. "About time." Others followed, not in a crowd, one by one. Men Graham had served with, trained beside, trusted. They did not make speeches. They did not ask for apologies. They stood near him during interviews, answered questions honestly, corrected records quietly. Their support was not loud, but it was unmistakable. In rooms built for hierarchy, their presence altered the balance. Late in the week, Hannah received the memo. She read it once, then again. Findings preliminary. Report language inconsistent with available data. Recommendations for amendment pending. The phrasing was cautious, but the meaning was clear. The old conclusion could no longer stand unchallenged. Graham was called back to the conference room. Calloway stood as he entered, a small gesture that carried weight. "The board has authorized a formal correction to your service record," Calloway said. "The incident will no longer be listed as equipment failure attributable to handler oversight." Graham absorbed the words slowly. "What does that change?" Calloway met his eyes. "Your name is cleared." There was no rush of relief, no visible reaction. Graham simply nodded. The past did not vanish when acknowledged, but it stopped pressing inward. "And returning?" Graham asked, though he already knew the answer. Calloway shook his head. "That path is closed. Time doesn't reverse." "I understand," Graham said. He had understood long before. Outside the room, Breyer moved within the isolation enclosure, pacing once, then stopping. His posture had changed subtly over the days, the tension easing in small increments. He was not calmer because of kindness or proximity. He was calmer because something unresolved had begun to move. Hannah stood beside the glass, watching him. "He knows," she said quietly. "Knows what?" Graham asked. "That he was heard." The departure did not come with ceremony. No speeches, no handshakes lined up at the gate. The facility returned to its routines with the quiet efficiency it had always relied on, and Graham Ellis Northwood moved through it one last time as he had arrived, without drawing attention. Morning light lay pale across the concrete buildings, the snow along the edges beginning to soften as winter loosened its grip. A transport vehicle waited near the service road, its engine idling, exhaust drifting upward in thin white plumes. Breyer walked beside Graham without a leash. It was not a privilege granted lightly, but it had been approved without resistance. The handlers who passed them paused only briefly, their eyes following the dog's steady gait, the way his shoulder aligned naturally with Graham's leg. Breyer moved differently now. The tension that once held his body in a constant state of readiness had eased, replaced by something quieter and more deliberate. He was still alert, still aware, but the watchfulness no longer carried urgency. His amber eyes took in the surroundings without searching for threats that never came. At the administrative door, Hannah Price waited. She wore a simple jacket over her work clothes, her hair pulled back as usual, her posture relaxed in a way Graham had not seen before. Hannah had always been precise, careful. shaped by responsibility. The days following the investigation had not softened her professionalism, but they had given it space to breathe. "You'll receive the updated protocols," she said, "for the evaluation work." "I'll review them," Graham replied. She nodded, then looked down at Briar. "He'll adjust," she said. "He already is." Graham followed her gaze. Briar had stopped near the edge of the lot, sitting calmly, ears upright, but loose, not waiting for instruction, simply present. "Thank you," Graham said. Hannah met his eyes. "For not walking away." He inclined his head once. That was enough. The drive north followed the shoreline, the road narrowing as it left the city behind. The town Graham had chosen was small, the kind of place built around water and weather rather than industry. Wooden docks stretched into the bay, their boards silvered by years of use. Fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings, nets stacked neatly along the pier. The houses were modest, spaced apart, most of them facing the water as if to keep an eye on it. Graham's house sat at the end of a quiet road, a single-story structure with weathered siding and wide windows that caught the afternoon light. He had bought it months earlier, drawn by the simplicity of it. No neighbors close enough to ask questions, no noise beyond wind and water. Inside, the rooms were sparse but clean. A table, a couch, a bed. Nothing unnecessary. Briar entered first, moving slowly, his nose working as he catalogued the unfamiliar space. He paused in the doorway, then stepped inside, nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. He circled once, then twice, before settling near the window that overlooked the bay. From there, he could see everything. Graham watched him, a faint tightening in his chest easing as Briar lay down, head resting on his paws. The posture was loose, unguarded. It was the first time Graham had seen him fully at rest in years. The days that followed found a rhythm quickly. Mornings began early, the two of them walking the shoreline while the town was still quiet. Briar moved ahead at times, then fell back into step, his pace matching Graham's without instruction. People they passed nodded politely, curious but not intrusive. In a place like this, strangers were left alone unless they asked otherwise. Twice a week, Graham drove back toward the city, not to the facility, but to a smaller center on the outskirts where former working dogs were assessed for rehabilitation. The building was unremarkable, its staff a mix of trainers and veterinary specialists who had chosen work that sat outside formal command. Graham's role there was narrow by design. Observation, pattern recognition, quiet input when something felt off. One of the first dogs he evaluated was a Belgian Malinois named Tessa, 5 years old, lean and restless, her movements sharp and repetitive. She had been flagged as anxious, unsuitable for reassignment. Her handler, a young woman named Erin Walsh, stood nearby, arms folded tightly, her posture rigid. Erin was tall and thin, her red hair pulled into a tight braid, her expression guarded. A vehicle accident during transport months earlier had left her shaken, and the guilt she carried over Tessa's injuries had hardened into self-blame. Graham did not approach Tessa immediately. He watched her pace, noted the timing, the triggers. When he finally stepped closer, he did not speak. He simply stood within her line of sight and waited. Tessa slowed, her pacing interrupted by uncertainty rather than fear. "She's not broken," Graham said quietly to Erin. "She's bracing." Erin exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly. It was the first time someone had said that. Briar accompanied Graham on those days, waiting patiently in the observation area. Other dogs noticed him. Some watched with curiosity, others with caution. Briar did not engage. He did not challenge. He simply existed, calm and present, a steady point in a space full of unsettled energy. At home, evenings were quiet. Graham cooked simply, the windows open when weather allowed, the sound of water carrying in. Briar chose his spots carefully, sometimes near the door, sometimes by the couch, occasionally stretched out in a patch of sun on the floor. He slept deeply now, dreams no longer pulling his legs into sudden movement. One afternoon, Graham sat on the porch, a mug cooling in his hands, watching Briar lie near the steps. The dog's chest rose and fell in an easy rhythm. His ears flicked occasionally at distant sounds, but he did not rise. Graham realized then that he had stopped waiting for something to happen. The constant readiness that had defined both of them for so long had loosened its hold. A woman walking her elderly Labrador paused at the edge of the yard, offering a polite wave. She was middle-aged, bundled against the wind, her expression open and curious. "He's a beautiful dog," she said. "Thank you," Graham replied. The woman smiled. "Looks like he's earned his rest." Graham looked down at Briar. "He has?" As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the water in muted gold and gray, Briar lifted his head briefly, then rested it back down. No tension, no alert, just contentment. For years, Briar had held a moment in place, waiting for someone to see it, to acknowledge it, to act. That waiting had defined him, shaped every movement, every reaction. Now the moment had passed, not erased, but answered. Graham stood and went inside, leaving the door open. Briar did not follow immediately. He remained where he was, watching the water, the world moving without threat or urgency. After a while, he rose and padded inside, settling near Graham's chair, close enough to touch. Some missions ended with orders. Others ended quietly, when the watch was no longer needed. Many of us carry moments like Briar did. Memories that were never acknowledged, warnings that were ignored, pain that stayed unresolved. But God sees what others overlook. He hears the quiet signals before the storm, and in His time, what was hidden is brought into the light. In everyday life, we are often asked to choose between convenience and conscience, between staying silent or standing for what is right. This story reminds us that even when the system fails, faith does not. Even when justice moves slowly, it still moves. And even when we feel alone, God is already working ahead of us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to let others know they are not alone. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of courage, faith, and truth can reach those who need them. And if you believe, take a moment right now to pray for everyone watching. May God protect those who are waiting. May He heal those who are tired. May He guide those who are standing quietly for the truth. If you agree, type Amen in the comments. God bless you, and thank you for being part of this community.